I woke up to the familiar hum of the coffee machine and the soft glow of the morning sun peeking through the curtains. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of toast from the kitchen. It was one of those mornings where everything seemed to be in its place, calm, predictable, and ordinary. Sophia was still in the bedroom, getting dressed for work. I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the newspaper, my eyes skimming over headlines that meant little to me. The world seemed to be unfolding as it always had, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the unease that had been growing between us. It had been months since Sophia and I had felt truly close. I noticed the small things, the coldness in her voice when she spoke to me, the way she avoided eye contact, the long hours she spent at work. It wasn't just that she had become distant. It was as if we had been slowly drifting apart, like two parallel lines that never quite intersected. I was only half paying attention to the paper when I saw the headline that caught my eye. It was about a man, Robert Tolson, an employee at a real estate agency. He had been found dead, executed in his own garage. The details were sparse. He had been thumped and then strangled. The police had no suspects, and the investigation was just beginning. The agency where Robert worked, Callis Realty, was also where Sophia had started working recently. I knew the name well. It was where she spent most of her time these days. I folded the paper and set it aside, the weight of the words sinking into me. Something about the way I felt this morning didn't feel right. Maybe it was the lingering tension I couldn't seem to shake. Or maybe it was the thought of her spending so much time with people I barely knew, people I couldn't trust. I didn't know why, but I could feel the quiet gnawing at my gut. Sophia entered the kitchen, and I looked up to greet her, but the words died in my throat. Her eyes were scanning the paper, and when she saw the article about Robert Tolson's death, I watched as her face twisted in shock. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the paper. Her face went pale, and I could see the color drain from her skin. "Oh, my God," she muttered, almost in disbelief. Then she rushed to the bathroom, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I sat there for a moment, stunned. I hadn't seen her react like that to anything in a long time. My heart raced, my thoughts scrambling. What was going on? Why was she so affected by a story about a man she didn't even know? I wasn't sure what to think, but there was something unsettling about the way she had reacted. I stood up slowly, placed my coffee cup in the dishwasher, and grabbed my briefcase. I didn't feel the urge to check on her, to ask if she was okay. The connection between us had been broken for so long that I wasn't sure if I even cared anymore. I left the house without a word, the door clicking behind me. The drive to work felt endless. My mind kept drifting back to Sophia. I tried to focus, but the thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. The unease in my chest, the coldness between us. It was all spiraling out of control. I pulled into the office parking lot, my mind still racing. But as I sat there in my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening in my marriage, it was far from ordinary. It had been a slow descent, a series of subtle shifts in our relationship that I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, I thought it was just the stress. Her long hours at work, the projects piling up, the pressure on both of us. We were both tired, pulled in different directions. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal once the dust settled. But the dust never did settle. It only grew thicker. Sophia had always been the center of my world. Her laugh, her smile, the warmth she radiated when she entered a room, it used to fill our home. But lately, that warmth had become a distant memory. The woman who had once laughed freely now barely spoke a word when we shared a meal together. I could feel her slipping away, piece by piece, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, my fingers just couldn't find their grip. At first, it was small things, like how she stopped asking about my day, how she'd retreat into her phone or computer during dinner, barely acknowledging my presence. Then there were the evenings when she'd come home late, too late to even have a real conversation, and when she did speak, it felt forced, almost like she was going through the motions. Her words were clipped, cold, no warmth in her voice, no spark in her eyes, just a distant echo of the woman I had married. I didn't know how to confront it. how to talk about it. Every time I tried, the conversation ended in an awkward silence, a feeling of discomfort hanging between us. She'd make excuses. Work had been crazy, she was just tired, she needed some time to herself. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I felt like there was more to it. My instincts, those nagging feelings that I had learned to ignore over the years, were telling me that something was off. Then there was the shift in her demeanor. She became more withdrawn, more distant. When she'd talk about her colleagues, there was a certain fondness in her voice that I couldn't ignore. She spoke about them with a warmth, a lightness, that I hadn't heard in her voice in years. I hated the feeling that crept into my chest each time she mentioned their names, especially the one who seemed to be at the center of every story. Robert Tolson. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just work gossip, harmless chatter. But something in the way she smiled when she spoke of him, something in her eyes, told me that it wasn't just work. There was a familiarity there that didn't sit right with me. I couldn't pinpoint why, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach whenever she mentioned him. The nights were the worst. Sophia would lie beside me in bed, but it felt like there were miles of space between us. She would turn away, her back to me, her mind elsewhere. I tried to reach out, to pull her closer, but she would gently move away, her body stiff, her mind clearly elsewhere. It was as though we were living in two different worlds, sharing the same space but not truly connecting. And when I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The unease gnawed at me, but I didn't know what it was. I had never been the type to dwell on doubts or paranoia, but this felt different. This was not just the result of a rough patch. This was something deeper, something that I wasn't prepared to face. And yet, every time I looked at her, I felt a cold distance growing between us, like an invisible barrier I couldn't cross. On the surface, everything looked fine. We still went through the motions, dinner together, casual conversations, even the occasional shared laugh. But I could feel the weight of the silence between us. I could feel the emotional gap widening, and no matter how hard I tried to bridge it, it only seemed to grow. The woman I had once known, the woman who had made me feel like I was the center of her world, was slipping away, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it. It was on a Tuesday night when the change became too obvious to ignore. She came home late again, but this time she didn't even seem to notice the tension in the air. I was sitting on the couch, waiting for her, as I had done countless times before. She walked in, glanced at me briefly, then went straight to the kitchen without saying a word. The silence was deafening. I couldn't remember the last time we had shared a genuine conversation, the last time we had connected beyond the surface level. She didn't even look at me when I asked her about her day. Her answer was quick, dismissive. Busy. Long day. I'm exhausted. I tried to keep the conversation going, but she wasn't having it. It was as if she was physically present, but emotionally miles away. And as I sat there, I realized that I was no longer the man she turned to when she needed someone. I wasn't the one who made her smile anymore. I wasn't the one who held her in the quiet moments. I was just a stranger in her life now. And that's when I realized the distance between us had already grown too wide to fix. There was no going back. Something had already changed. Something had already broken. The turning point in our marriage didn't happen with a loud bang, but with a quiet whisper. It was the small, almost imperceptible shifts, the moments when I would look at Sophia and feel like I didn't know her anymore. The woman I had married seemed to be vanishing right before my eyes, leaving behind a stranger who had learned to hide her emotions behind a wall of indifference. The cracks in our relationship began to show around the time when she started working at the real estate agency. I had always supported her ambitions, her desire to build something for herself, to take on more responsibility. But this felt different. Sophia was driven, yes, but there was a sharpness to her determination now, a coldness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. She wasn't the same woman I had once admired for her warmth and compassion. I tried to understand. I did. She was working long hours, staying late, attending meetings that stretched into the evening. But the distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And no matter how much I reached out, No matter how many nights I stayed up waiting for her to come home, I couldn't breach the wall she had erected between us. It wasn't long before I began to question everything. Why was she coming home later and later? Why was she so detached? I started to see the signs, the tiny details that didn't make sense, the way she would brush me off when I asked her about her day, how she would quickly turn her attention back to her phone or computer whenever we were together. The warm, loving woman I had married seemed to be slipping further away, replaced by someone who barely acknowledged my presence. And then there was Robert Tolson. At first, I thought it was just work talk, but over time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Sophia's voice would soften when she mentioned him, how her eyes would light up with excitement when talking about her work, about him. It was subtle, but it was there. I didn't need to be a detective to know that the warmth in her voice was reserved for someone else now. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head. I told myself I was being paranoid, overthinking things. But the more I watched, the more I saw. Sophia became colder, distant, and no amount of effort on my part seemed to bring her back. I could feel her pulling away from me like a thread slowly unraveling until there was nothing left but silence. The space between us had grown, and it felt impossible to bridge. One night I finally confronted her. It had been building for weeks, the tension growing too thick to ignore. I asked her, not accusing, but desperate, "Sophia, what's going on with us? You're not the same. You've been so distant. I don't know how to reach you anymore." She looked at me, her face impassive. For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice that barely resembled the woman I knew, she said, "I'm just busy. Work is overwhelming right now. I don't have time for all of this." She waved a hand dismissively as if my concerns were insignificant. I was stunned. "Busy," I echoed, feeling the weight of her words crush me. "What about us? What about our marriage?" But she didn't respond. She didn't even seem to care enough to explain. Her words were like a door closing, a door that I had been desperately trying to keep open. But now all I could hear was the finality of it slamming shut. The days that followed were no better. It was as if I were living with a stranger. We continued to share a bed, but the connection was gone. She would lie next to me, but it felt as if there were miles between us. And no matter how much I tried to reach out, it seemed like she was always one step ahead, already gone, already somewhere else. I watched her disappear right before my eyes, and it was breaking me. I couldn't understand how the woman who once made me feel like the luckiest man in the world could now look at me like I was a mere inconvenience in her life. But there was something deeper than just the distance that had formed between us. There was a hollow pain growing inside me, a sense of betrayal that I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't just her indifference, but something more, something that I was too afraid to confront. I didn't know if I could handle the truth. I started to search for answers, to dig into the cracks she had left in her wake. Every late-night work session, every half-hearted excuse, every evasive look. There had to be something more. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but deep down, I knew I needed to know. As I sat in the silence of our home one evening, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I realized that the marriage I had once known, the partnership I had cherished, was falling apart. And as much as I wanted to fix it, as much as I longed for things to return to the way they were, I knew deep down that things were never going to be the same again. It was late on a Wednesday when I first stumbled upon it. I had been at work all day, my mind distracted by the endless stream of tasks, emails, and meetings. But when I finally sat down at my desk that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had started to sense a shift in the air, a tension that I could no longer ignore. Sophia had been distant, more than usual, and that gnawing feeling in my stomach hadn't gone away. I was just about to check my emails when I saw it. It was an unusual notification on my phone. An unknown number had sent me a link with no explanation, no subject, just a simple message. Want to know the truth? The sense of foreboding in my chest grew, but my curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link, my heart pounding in my ears. A photo loaded on the screen and I froze. It was Sophia, but not the way I had ever seen her before. She was standing close to a man, her arms wrapped around him as they kissed. It was an intimate moment, and my breath caught in my throat. The shock of it hit me like a punch to the stomach. There was no mistaking it. Sophia, my wife, was in the arms of another man. My mind raced, the words not fully registering. I zoomed in on the image, praying that I had imagined it, but there it was, undeniable and cruel. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I knew this man, Robert Tolson. The name clicked in my brain like a lock turning. The same Robert who had been at the center of her late-night stories, the one who had made her smile in a way that made my stomach churn. The very man I had begun to suspect but never thought I would see in this way. The image was clear. She wasn't just working with him. She wasn't just talking about him. She was in his arms. And worse still, it wasn't just a kiss. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of something far deeper, far more intimate, the kind of kiss that no one shares unless there is more at play. I quickly scrolled down, hoping for some explanation, some sign that this was some kind of sick joke. But then my phone screen flashed to another photo. This time, they were in a motel room. Sophia was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Robert was standing next to her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that seemed too familiar, too possessive. My stomach churned violently. I felt as though the room had shrunk, the walls closing in on me as the photos kept appearing. The next image made my blood run cold. They were both unclothed, their bodies entwined in a way that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. My mind rebelled against what my eyes were seeing, but there was no denying the truth. Sophia was cheating on me. And it was with Robert, the very man I had tried to convince myself was just a colleague. The photos kept coming, each more incriminating than the last. I could feel the air in my lungs turning thick, suffocating me. The words betrayal, deceit, and heartbreak echoed in my mind, but they felt hollow. There was nothing left to say. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the images, trying to bring some sense of clarity to my racing thoughts, but it was futile. I could feel the anger starting to boil within me. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and the reality of what I had seen began to sink in. Sophia, my wife, had been lying to me. For how long? How much had she hidden from me while I was oblivious to the truth? I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to feel. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, rage, confusion, but underneath it all there was a cold clarity. I knew without a doubt that things would never be the same. This was the moment that would change everything. I clicked on the final link, almost afraid of what I would see. A message appeared at the bottom of the screen. Want to know what happened after this? Click here. I hesitated. I knew what the next photo would reveal, but I couldn't stop myself. I clicked. The final photo was a shot of Sophia lying on the bed, Robert beside her, both of them in a moment of intimacy. The last words in the message cut through me like a blade. Prick provided by Robert Tolson. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the photos pressing down on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling as if the floor had been ripped from beneath me. The shock of the discovery had faded, but the rage was only just beginning to build. The cold realization of what Sophia had done to me, what she had been doing behind my back, settled in with a clarity that was both horrifying and liberating. I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. I wasn't going to let this go, not without making her feel the same sting she had inflicted on me. I didn't want to admit it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was no longer the man I had been a year ago. The man who believed in second chances, who believed in forgiveness, in trying to fix what was broken. The man who had trusted his wife with his heart and soul, only to have it torn apart. That man was gone. In his place was something colder, darker, someone who had been shattered by betrayal and was ready to make those responsible pay. The first thing I did was delete the photos. Every single image of them together, of her with him, was burned into my memory, but I didn't want any evidence. I didn't want to leave anything behind that might come back to haunt me. The email was erased, the file was wiped from my system. I wanted to forget it all, but I knew that I never would. The pain would stay with me forever. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every moment, every detail came rushing back. The way she had avoided me, how she'd spent long hours at work, her lies about late meetings and business trips. How had I been so blind? How had I not seen it? The more I thought about it, the more the desire for revenge started to take root. I didn't know if it was anger or the sheer injustice of it all, but something inside me snapped. I could feel it growing, like a fire that started as a spark but was quickly becoming an inferno. I had been humiliated. I had been played for a fool, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not without a taste of the pain she had caused me. I called Carmine that night, my old friend who had always been there for me, for better or worse. We hadn't spoken much in recent months, but I knew if anyone could help me, it was him. His voice was low and cautious when he picked up. "JC, what's up? You sound different." I could barely contain the venom in my voice. "I know about Robert Tolson. I know everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Carmine spoke, his voice now tinged with concern. "What are you going to do, JC?" "I'm going to make her pay. Both of them." Carmine didn't argue, didn't tell me to calm down or think things through. He knew better than anyone how far I could go when I felt betrayed. "You want my help?" "Yeah, I need it." "All right," he said, a grim edge to his voice. "What's the plan?" I didn't have all the details figured out yet, but I knew where I wanted to start. Robert Tolson had to be dealt with. He was the one who had crossed the line with my wife, the one who had manipulated her, convinced her to betray me. He was going to suffer for it. Carmine was the kind of guy who knew how to make things happen. He wasn't the one to ask questions, just the one to deliver results. And right now, that's exactly what I needed. The idea of making Robert suffer wasn't satisfying, not yet. My mind kept returning to Sophia. She had been the one who had taken everything from me, the trust, the love, the life we had built together. She had broken our vows, shattered everything I thought I knew about her. And for what? For him? She would pay. She had to. I thought about how to make her feel what I was feeling, how to show her that the world she had turned her back on was no longer a safe place for her. It wasn't just about punishing her. It was about making her see the consequences of her actions. I couldn't let her walk away from this as if it was nothing, as if nothing had changed. The rage still burned inside me, but it was a controlled fire now. It had a purpose. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the one in control, the one who would set the rules. The next day, I spent hours crafting the perfect plan, making calls, setting things in motion. Every detail had to be precise. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. And when it was time, when everything was ready, I would execute it with the precision I had learned over the years. I couldn't let Sophia or Robert walk away unscathed, not after what they had done to me. My mind kept racing as I thought about the future, about what was next. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about power, about reclaiming what was mine and showing them that I wasn't the man they thought I was. I wasn't the fool they had taken advantage of. I would make sure that they both understood the price of betrayal. And once I had made them pay, I would finally be able to breathe again. The plans had been set in motion. It was a strange feeling, like I was watching myself from the outside, detached, methodical. The anger was still there, but it was no longer just rage. It was something colder, more calculating. Each move I made was deliberate, each action purposeful. I wasn't just acting on impulse anymore. I had a goal, and I was going to see it through. I couldn't afford to be careless. I knew that any misstep could ruin everything. Carmine had already made the first move, and I trusted him to handle Robert. But that wasn't enough. I had to ensure that my revenge was as comprehensive as I had imagined. Sophia wasn't going to walk away from this. No one would ever be able to forget the price of betrayal. The first part of the plan was simple. I started small, sending flowers to Sophia's office, a subtle reminder of the life we once had. Nothing extravagant, just enough to get her attention. She hadn't responded to my earlier attempts to reach her, but this might get through. A simple gesture, one that would make her feel the weight of what she had done. I knew she would be curious, would wonder what I was up to. It would plant the seed of doubt in her mind. I didn't wait around for a response. I had bigger things to focus on. The next step was a dinner reservation. I knew the place she liked, the one where we'd had so many dinners before, back when we still felt like a couple. I reserved a table, left messages for her, telling her how much I wanted to talk, to reconnect. I knew she wouldn't show up, but I needed her to see that I had tried. I wanted her to understand that, despite everything, I was still trying to make things work. By the time she finally came home that evening, I had already left. She didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me. I had no interest in hearing her excuses. When she walked in and saw the empty house, I wanted her to feel that absence, feel it the way I had felt it every night she stayed away, every time she withdrew further from me. The second part of the plan was just as important, maybe even more so. I needed to make her feel isolated, like she was losing control of everything. Her world was about to unravel, and I had to be the one to pull the strings. She had spent so much time pretending, acting like everything was fine, but it was all an illusion. Tonight, she would see just how thin that illusion was. I wasn't sure how she would react, but I didn't care. Her emotional detachment was no longer a barrier for me. It was just one more part of the game I was playing, one more piece in the puzzle I was carefully piecing together. She wouldn't have the luxury of silence anymore. The next day, I received a call from Carmine. "It's done," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that told me everything I needed to know. Robert was taken care of. The details didn't matter. All I needed to hear was that the man who had crossed the line with my wife was no longer a threat. But that wasn't enough for me. I wasn't finished yet. I could hear Sophia moving around the house that evening, the sound of her footsteps heavy with the weight of what she had done. She wasn't the same woman I had married. She wasn't the woman who had smiled at me with love in her eyes. She was just a stranger now, one who had shattered everything we had built together. And as I sat there, waiting for her to return home, I could feel it. The final part of my plan was almost complete. I had everything in place. All the pieces were aligned. She would know what it felt like to betray me. She would understand the cost of her actions. I heard the door open. Her footsteps were slow, hesitant. She walked into the kitchen, still unaware of what was coming. It wasn't about getting an apology anymore. It wasn't about seeking closure. It was about power, taking back what she had stolen from me. I wasn't the man she thought I was, and I would make sure she knew it. Sophia didn't say anything at first, but I didn't expect her to. She knew something was different. She could feel it, the tension in the air. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to let her walk away without feeling what I had felt. The plans were in motion and nothing could stop them now. The room felt thick with anticipation. It was almost time. I could hear her breathing, the uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. She had no idea what was coming for her, and I was going to make sure she never forgot it. The evening passed like a heavy fog settling over my thoughts. Sophia hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. At first I tried to brush it off. Work, late meetings, deadlines. Those were the excuses I had gotten used to hearing. But this time, there was something different about the silence. It wasn't just the cold distance that had been growing between us. It was the uncertainty, the unease gnawing at my gut. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. She was probably just caught up with some last-minute work. Or maybe she was out with her colleagues, grabbing a drink after a long day. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I called her phone several times, but there was no answer. No voicemail. No nothing. The call simply ended, as if it had been cut off mid-ring. I left a message, but it felt hollow, like I was talking to a void. By midnight, I was pacing the house. I couldn't sit still. My thoughts were racing, bouncing between the worst-case scenarios. Maybe she had just decided to stay at Robert's. Maybe she was finally walking away from me. The thought burned in my chest, but the more I turned it over, the more it made sense. After everything that had happened, after all the lies, maybe this was the final act, the one where she disappeared, leaving me in the wreckage of our marriage. I thought back to the dinner reservation I had made earlier that week. She hadn't shown up. I wasn't surprised, but I also hadn't been prepared for it. Now, as I sat alone in the silence of our home, it was clear to me, she wasn't just avoiding me. She was vanishing, and I had no idea why or where. The hours dragged on. I sat at the kitchen table, the clock ticking loudly in the empty house. My mind kept replaying the past few days, trying to find some clue, some hint that would explain her behavior. But I couldn't find anything. There had been no warning, no indication that she was planning to leave. It was as if she had simply slipped away, like a shadow disappearing into the night. I tried calling her again, but this time it went straight to voicemail. Panic surged within me, followed by a cold, unsettling realization. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know what was happening to her. My anger and resentment toward her had clouded my judgment, but now, in this moment, I was struck with fear. I couldn't control what was happening. She was gone, and I had no way of knowing where she had gone or why. The next morning, I called her office. Her assistant told me that Sophia hadn't shown up for work that day, or the day before. She hadn't called in sick, hadn't given any notice, nothing. I felt a pang of dread in my stomach. Where the hell was she? Had she really left me without a word? Was this her final way of telling me that everything between us was over? I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. I needed answers. I called the police, hoping for some direction, some sign that they could help me find her. But when the officer on the other end of the line assured me that they would look into it, I could tell from his tone that he didn't think much of it. "People go missing sometimes," he said flatly. "It's not uncommon." But this wasn't like any other missing person case. This wasn't just a random disappearance. This was my wife, the woman who had been slipping away from me for months. And now, she was gone. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if she had planned this. Was this some kind of escape, or was she in danger? The possibilities spiraled in my mind, but none of them seemed to bring me any comfort. My emotions were a mix of confusion, anger, and helplessness. I had to find her, but I didn't know where to start. Days passed, and there was no word from Sophia. The police had little to go on, and I was left to navigate this nightmare on my own. I tried everything, calling friends, calling people from her work, but no one knew where she was. It was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth. Then, after nearly a week of silence, I received an unexpected call. It was from her best friend, Amanda. I hadn't heard from Amanda in months, but she sounded anxious, frantic even. She told me that Sophia had gone to Atlantic City for a conference, but that she hadn't heard from her since she left. The more she spoke, the more I realized that something wasn't right. Why hadn't Sophia told me about this trip? Why hadn't she mentioned it at all? The confusion in Amanda's voice mirrored my own growing sense of dread. I had no idea where Sophia was or why she had vanished. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just an ordinary disappearance. There was something far more sinister at play here, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her running away from our marriage. It was about something bigger, something darker, and I was going to find out what it was. The days that followed Sophia's disappearance felt like an endless void. I couldn't escape the questions swirling in my mind, each one more suffocating than the last. Where was she? Why hadn't she contacted me? What was she running from, or worse, who was she running to? The police had opened an investigation, though it felt more like a formality than anything else. Detective Lawrence Backton was assigned to the case, and I could tell from the first meeting that he wasn't impressed. His gaze was clinical, his questions sharp and probing, and I could almost see him dismissing me as just another husband, desperate to find his wife. When he first arrived at my house, he didn't even ask for my thoughts on the situation. Instead, he dove straight into the facts. Where had she last been? When did I last speak to her? He wanted a timeline, as if that would be enough to piece together her disappearance. But the timeline meant nothing to me. It was the emotional gaps, the silence that spoke louder than any concrete fact that I couldn't ignore. I knew something wasn't right. "Have you spoken to her family? Friends?" Detective Backton asked, scribbling notes in his notebook. "Anyone who might know where she is?" I shook my head, still replaying the empty house, the unanswered calls. "I've tried. No one knows anything. It's like she vanished off the face of the earth." He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. "And you don't think this is just her wanting to leave? Some sort of break from the marriage?" The question hit me like a slap. I wanted to lash out, tell him that he didn't know what he was talking about, but I held it back. I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I swallowed it down. No, that's not it. She wouldn't just leave like that without saying anything. She's never done that before. Backton raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He simply jotted down more notes, as though he already had me figured out. The unsettling feeling of being misunderstood crept up my spine. Was I just another husband making excuses? Or was there something more to her disappearance that he wasn't seeing? As the days passed, the investigation began to feel like a dead end. No witnesses, no signs of forced entry, and no clues that led anywhere concrete. Sophia's belongings were all still here. Her clothes, her phone, her laptop. If she had run off, she hadn't taken anything with her. It didn't add up. The worst part was the sense of growing suspicion. Detective Backton, in his quiet but persistent way, began to question me more closely. Were there problems in the marriage? Was I aware of any external factors that could have led to her leaving? I tried to stay calm, to remain composed, but the questions only seemed to get sharper with each visit. Every time he looked at me, I felt as though he was digging deeper, searching for something he thought I was hiding. It wasn't just Backton's questions that made me uneasy. The more I thought about everything, Sophia's sudden disappearance, her distance in the months leading up to it, the more I realized that there were things I hadn't paid attention to. Little details, flashes of behavior that now seemed all too telling. Her secretive conversations, the late-night hours at work, the way her phone was always tucked away when I was around. I thought back to the times I had questioned her, only to be dismissed with excuses. And then there was Robert Tolson, the man who had been a frequent subject of conversation, the man whose name now echoed in my mind like a warning bell. I knew I couldn't be sure of anything, not yet. But as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I felt a creeping suspicion take root. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Sophia's disappearance wasn't just a random act. It was deliberate, planned. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if Robert was involved. Detective Backton's next visit was just as uncomfortable as the previous ones. He asked about the last time I saw Sophia, about her state of mind, about her emotional well-being. I was starting to see the pattern. The more I tried to explain, the more he seemed to be examining my every word, my every gesture. "You seemed pretty sure about her leaving before," he noted casually. "Why are you so certain now that something's wrong?" I felt a surge of frustration. "Because she wouldn't just leave without a word. You don't understand. This isn't like her." He studied me for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not so sure about that," he said. "There's something about this case that doesn't sit right. You've been very calm throughout all this, a little too calm." I felt my pulse quicken, my chest tightening. Was he implying something? Was he suggesting I knew more than I was letting on? The weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog, and I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on me. "I don't know what you're trying to suggest," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm just trying to find my wife." Detective Backton didn't respond. Instead, he simply stood up, his chair scraping across the floor. "I'll keep in touch," he said, his tone cold. "But you might want to consider what you know and what you're not telling us." As he left, I stood in the doorway watching him walk away, a chill settling in my bones. His words replayed in my mind, a nagging presence I couldn't shake. Had he figured it out? Or was he just making a leap that would only lead us further into the unknown? I wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. The investigation was no longer just about finding Sophia. It had become about something else, a deeper, more dangerous web that was beginning to entangle me. It had been days since I had last heard from Sophia, but the stillness in the house felt like an eternity. The police investigation had hit a wall, and I felt more helpless with each passing hour. But in the silence, I found a clarity I hadn't expected. The anger, the betrayal, it wasn't something I could leave buried any longer. It was time for me to take control. Sophia had shattered the trust I had built for years. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Robert Tolson, too. The man who had taken what was mine, who had wormed his way into her life while I was left in the dark. I wasn't going to let either of them escape the consequences of their actions. I had spent nights planning this, every detail, every move. Every piece of this puzzle had to fall into place. I wasn't going to let them get away with it, not without making them feel the weight of their choices. Carmine had been instrumental in getting rid of Robert. The message had been clear. Anyone who touched what was mine would pay. Robert's life was now a whisper, a memory. He would never hurt me again. But Sophia, she was another story. She wasn't just a casualty of this whole mess. She was the architect of it. I spent days thinking about what I would do, how I would make her understand the depth of her betrayal. The plan was simple, but the execution had to be flawless. I wanted her to feel every ounce of pain I had felt, to experience the devastation she had caused. But I couldn't act rashly. No, this had to be calculated. Every step had to make her realize what she had done. I called Sophia's office, and when they told me she was in a meeting, I hung up without saying another word. It felt almost absurd how easily I could manipulate her life now. The woman I had once loved was now a puppet in my game, and I was the one pulling the strings. Later that day, I set everything in motion. I had arranged for a missing person report to be filed, making it seem as though I had no idea where she was. Let the police do their job. Let them stir in the confusion. I was always one step ahead. Sophia arrived home late that night, her footsteps hesitant as she walked through the door. She didn't know it yet, but everything was already in place. She had been avoiding me, distancing herself more with every passing day. She thought she could escape, but I had made sure she wouldn't. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. There was no need for pretense now. She looked at me, her eyes flickering with that same coldness I had grown used to. "I was at work," she replied, but there was something in her voice, something that told me she wasn't being honest. I didn't care about her excuses anymore. "Don't lie to me. You've been lying to me for months." Her face twitched, the familiar defensive barrier rising between us. "I haven't lied." "What is this about, John? What do you want?" I could feel the years of trust and loyalty crumbling beneath me. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about the years of her treating me like I was invisible, like I wasn't worth her time. "Do you know what it feels like?" I said, my voice rising now. "To give everything to someone and have them tear it all apart?" Her eyes darted away, but she didn't speak. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but it was buried beneath the veil of deflection. She was trying to convince herself that she had done nothing wrong. I walked toward her, and for the first time in a long while I saw her flinch. It wasn't fear, no, it was guilt. And in that moment, I knew I had her. The final act was about to unfold. I had arranged for her to meet me at a restaurant. I sent flowers earlier that day, knowing they would land on her desk, forcing her to confront the remnants of our life together. I had made sure she knew I was still capable of taking what I had once held dear and throwing it back in her face. But I wasn't going to let her have the satisfaction of seeing me broken anymore. I wasn't going to let her see the man she had destroyed. I would be strong, no matter how much it hurt. The consequences of her actions weren't just going to hit her emotionally. They were going to hit her in a way that would make her understand the depth of what she had done. Sophia arrived at the restaurant late, as I knew she would. She entered cautiously, her eyes scanning the room, searching for something or someone. When she saw me, her face twisted in confusion. She hadn't expected me to be so composed. She hadn't expected me to be so cold. I watched as she made her way to the table, but I didn't rise to greet her. I wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of feeling superior. As she sat down, I let the silence stretch between us. Her hand hovered over the wine glass, but she didn't reach for it. She was waiting for me to speak, but I wasn't in the mood to make small talk. "Do you know why you're here?" I finally asked, my voice steady. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't respond. "I did everything for you," I continued, my voice growing quieter now. "I gave you everything I had, and you—" I stopped, my throat tightening. "You threw it all away for him." Sophia's face softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her cold mask. But it wasn't enough. She didn't get to play the victim anymore. I stood up, ready to leave, but I turned to look at her one last time. "You'll remember this," I said, my words cutting through the silence. "Everything you've done, every lie, it'll all catch up with you, and when it does, you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything. What do you think of the character's journey in this story? From which region are you watching this video? If you enjoyed this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. Don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.